Hello there, guys. Today I wanted to make a quick vlog all about pain, really. I just got finished about a 3-hour tattoo session. I'm not going to get too much into that session today. That's a story for another time. But I figured this would be as good a time as any to talk quite a bit about pain and how I deal with pain and what I think of pain and everything around that topic. So I like to think of pain in different ways depending on what you're doing. Like, obviously, a piercing hurts differently than a tattoo, and even within that, stretching a piercing hurts differently than getting a piercing, or lining hurts different than shading, or all of these different things. But none of it hurts that much. None of it hurts enough to be particularly afraid of or uh, anxious about. I made a video on this channel, I would say 2 years ago, called Tattoos and Anxiety, and I haven't actually watched through it, but I think I loosely talked a little bit about um, how anticipation always makes things hurt more than they actually hurt, or the feeling more tangible than it actually is. So, what I mean by that is to say that nothing hurts as much as we imagine it will when we get there. So, part of how I medicate against pain is in my lack of preparation for the experience, rather than some form of preparation that I do beforehand. I do none, basically. I do have a way that I approach tattoos, um, sort of like a ritual, in that I always make sure that I'm very full before I go into a tattoo. And if I have a headache at all, this is the one thing I will say is I do take an ibuprofen before if I've ever had a headache before a tattoo, because the only times I've ever had a tattoo with a headache, I found it really hard to escape from the experience or deal with the pain of it, we'll say. So that is the one thing I will say is um, the only thing I've felt like has really impacted me greatly during a tattoo session or split my focus greatly is having, say, a headache. I don't find tattoos hurt that much more when I'm tired or run down, but I do find they hurt a lot more when I have a headache. So that's just my anecdotal experience. I think it's partly because I tend to dissociate quite a bit from a tattoo, and saying that the minute I sit down for a tattoo, I am over it. I'm already through it in my mind. So, for example, when I sat down today for my session, and true to life, because here I am, I said to myself, as soon as that first needle punctured my skin, it was, well, it's over now. Like, this experience is over already. And all I mean to say by that is, I know basically two things going into any tattoo session. The tattoo session will start and it will end. Everything that happens in between the beginning and the end may as well have already happened once it starts. Because I know that I'm paying for this service, I'm not going to walk away from it before it's over. So, in saying that, I'm committing to whatever feeling I get during that process. Um, there's also the fact that the first few minutes of any tattoo are the worst few minutes. No matter what session I've been in, no matter what area we've been working on, never seems to matter. What always matters is the first few minutes. Those hurt the most. Any session I've ever had. I've never had a session that got um, necessarily more painful as time went on. Now, there is a threshold where the skin starts feeling different after a certain amount of time, but generally speaking, uh, once the pain receptors have kind of given you that adrenaline rush that you get when you get, half an hour into a tattoo session, I do find that all the pain that you experience dulls off. And there's only so many times you can get tattooed and experience that change. before you start actively knowing that that's going to happen. And that makes those first few minutes more bearable. It makes them more tolerable, or more like you can escape. Now there are some places that obviously are harder to escape from than others. I'll get into that. Is um, things like your core, like anywhere on your stomach, or your chest, even, or your armpit, or things that aren't limbs, we'll say. I find those are harder to mentally detach from in the moment, but not impossible. Um, though, depending on what you're having done. So, say when I was having my ribs or stomach blacked out, I found it really hard to detach, or kind of meditate away from those feelings. But when I was getting the lining done on either my first torso or my third torso, which we just did more on today, um, I do find it's easier to drift away from that experience than it was to drift away from the blackout. I don't know if it's because there's a lot of breathers in that kind of work, but I found it really, really easy today, for example, to distract myself from the feelings of pain, by thinking of what I was going to be doing later, or some deeper thoughts on where I'm at in life, and some of the things I enjoy. Say if you're playing a video game or if you're reading a book or something, just thinking more on that stuff. I found it particularly useful during leg tattoos, both my old leg tattoos and the blackout tattoos. I found it particularly useful to get into a really long article on my phone or something, and just kind of get absorbed into a narrative. I could see reading a book, or I've seen some people listening to music during tattoos. Um, any way you can distract yourself from the feeling really helps. There are some that you can't do that with. Like, for example, today, the area that I was getting tattooed in, I was up on my side. And so obviously you're not going to be on your phone during that appointment. Um, in this case, once again, I feel like you're forced to be a little more present. Um, Now, there are some mental tactics you can use when you are present and you can't get away from the feeling that I find helpful. For example, actively reinforcing the mindset of nothing lasts forever. Like, this pain won't last forever. What bad feeling has ever lasted that long? Telling yourself, you know, how long is a day at work? Say you spend 8 hours at work and you don't love being at work. But two things are true: you always go, and it always ends. Same as a tattoo. So the discomfort won't last, but the tattoo will. Um, well, obviously, you can black over a tattoo and add new ones if you want, or you can have it lasered off, but that's besides the point. Um, any feeling of discomfort that you experience won't last very long, but what you get in return for it will. That's a huge, huge portion of my life in general. At a certain point in my tattoo journey, started to look at most of my life through that lens, and it made complicated, challenging decisions easier for me, where I know that if something's going to be hard, but it's going to be giving me a lasting result that I want, the tattooing that I've gone through has actually made it easier to make those sorts of decisions or sacrifices. Like, if it meant walking through fire to get the result that you've always wanted, it gets easier and easier for me to walk through that fire. Um, and that's a lot of what this is for me. Now, if you're only going to be getting a few tattoos, maybe you'll never get to that point of comprehension of the pain and the trade off that you get. And in that case, I would just say, as I said earlier, distraction is going to be your best friend. Really, just not paying attention to the pain, distracting yourself from it, is going to be your best ally. Um, like I said earlier, anytime you start a tattoo, just know that you're going to get through it. and you've paid to be here. No one is forcing you to do this. Too often, I get the feeling from people that they're being tortured, or that this isn't something that they chose once they start getting tattooed. Um, I don't really understand that mentality, because this is a very voluntary thing that you're doing. It's the whole industry only exists as almost like vanity. So none of this has to happen. That's the other thing. If you're dealing with too much pain that day, you don't need the tattoo. Nobody needs a tattoo. I mean, you could argue that I do, clearly, because I keep getting them. But we're in a luxury environment where the worst that happens is you have to come back the next day. That's another thing I wanted to get into a little bit, is there's a bit of an elitism around people sitting for a long period of time. Say, one of my most commonly asked questions is, how long was your longest sit? And while I always answer the question, and the answer is 9.5 hours, by the way, it's not a brag. There are people who've sat longer, obviously. Um, the answer to that question I never like to give. I'm always apprehensive, because I don't think that it's about sitting for a long, long time. I think that it's about marathons. I think that tattooing is about marathoning, not sprinting. And I feel like a better way to get tattooed is at a pace that you're comfortable with, that won't scare you off the next session. So, for example, today I did 3 hours. The last session I did was 2.5 hours, and I had a 4.5 hour session before that. None of these are going into double digits, and I don't ever want to be getting tattooed for 10 hours because it's boring and tiresome. I know some people will do it, and I'm not saying I couldn't, but I want to get tattooed in that 2 to 5 hour range, because that's a pace that I can, for one thing, afford reliably, and a pace that I can continuously make progress on something at that pace and not burn myself out on it. So yeah, I like to think that tattooing is better suited to shorter durations more often, rather than giant sessions where most people will tell you that it makes the skin actually resist the ink after a certain period of time, especially in, say, an area like the wrist. There's really only so long you can be working on a wrist before the skin starts to get chewed up and unwilling to take the ink. Now, obviously, I'm not a tattoo artist, but I do know that most wrists will only give you 30 minutes to an hour of saturation before you've kind of basically screwed up the skin enough, and you should probably just leave it alone for the day. A lot of artists struggle with that. A lot of young artists struggle with knowing when they've worked an area too long. So a better approach would be to put in a certain amount one day and then come back and hit it for touch-ups later. It's going to be less painful for the canvas, and it's going to be less frustrating for the artist to think of it that way. But that may be something that only a veteran artist might know. A younger artist lacking proper guidance might not know that. I had a lot of experiences like that on my right arm. For example, my whole right wrist was worked on for 6.5 hours one day, and almost none of it stayed. And even though the artist did it, was particularly light-handed and didn't go that hard, by the end of that session, it was hurting like no other tattoo artist I've ever had work on me. So, skin, once it becomes overworked, becomes more painful and ends up healing less well, obviously. So, another approach to the pain of tattooing is knowing that it will get more painful as time goes on, but that's not because the tattoo is hurting more. That's because your skin is getting more resistant, and the artist has to work harder to get the ink in. So, realistic expectations and setting your own limitations and setting a pace that you're comfortable with will make dealing with pain of a tattoo a lot easier for even someone with a weaker weaker pain threshold or tolerance. Now, as I said, if I had my way, what I would do for the rest of time, if I was trying to form a bodysuit from scratch, would be 2 hours every week kind of thing, rather than 8 hours once a month, if that makes sense. And I think that it's a healthier approach to keep your skin and your tattoo habits in general in better shape long term. Anyway, that's just a bit of my rambling on tattoo pain, and I guess I got into a little bit of healing and stuff like that in tattoo sessions. But I have a lot more thoughts on this topic, but there's way too much to cover in one video, and I don't want to exhaust it too much. So that's going to be this one. And the next video, I will be showing off the tattoo that I got done today, and kind of outlining the journey forward as I'm getting into, I would say, the long part of this tattoo journey now. Not the long part of the journey in general, but this journey, the third bodysuit. Now I'm getting into sort of chipping away, and there'll be less immediate, like, huge reveals. It'll be more just piece by piece from here. So anyway, I look forward to showing that off, and I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll talk to you guys again soon.